I'm just going to tweak my markup a tiny bit before I go crazy with CSS. Right now, I've just got an h1, a form, and then the div, right? I'm just going to wrap the form and the div inside this main element. Main is an HTML5 element. It's basically the same thing as a div. It's just that main has some sort of implied semantic meaning, which makes it a little neater in our markup and keeps us from doing things like div ID equals main. Let's just make a main element. Sure, why not? And then inside there, I wrap the form in a div, and this is already a div. The reason I did that is because I want some CSS to apply to both of those things. So now we have a main element with two divs in it. Let's go a styling. This is not primarily a CSS class, so don't sweat it too much if this is a bit much, but you can read this and see what you can see later on. So the first thing I do here is import a Google font, and we will talk about that in the next project we build. We'll talk about that tomorrow probably. We already had this padding. Now I set the font for the body to Open Sans, the font that I got from Google. And if that's not found, if it fails to load for whatever reason, and you don't have it installed on your machine in the browser, just fall back to any old sans serif font. H1, I specify the font. 800, that would be the font weight. 800 is really bold, extra bold. 64 pixels high, which we know is 4 rims, right? Anybody know what that is? It's the line height. Text transform, uppercase. So no matter how I typed it in, it's going to make it all caps, the H1. And it's going to center it. Remember this selector syntax from yesterday? What does this mean about the relationship between the H1 and the span? First of all, which element is this targeting? Which element is this going to style, the H1 or the span? The span. Have we talked about spans? They're kind of like divs. They're both generic container elements. The difference being div is a block element, like a paragraph, where it takes up an entire line. There's always a line break afterward. It's full width. A span is an inline element. So something like a link or EM or strong or something like that where there's no line break afterward. You put it in the middle of other stuff. So it's styling the span. So what is the H1 part telling us? This is a span that is a descendant of the H1. In other words, it's somewhere inside it. The H1 is an ancestor up in the tree. So then, inside the H1, I put a span with person. And then stats is outside that span. So then I just said, transform it to all lowercase, make it italic, use a different font, put some margin on it, and I end up with this. Why? Why not? Now for layout here, I'm using something called Flexbox, which we're not going to get real deeply into just yet. It's a new way of laying things out that's really powerful and really cool. And pretty widely supported now, but there are still some older browsers that are not entirely uncommon that don't really support it right. So there's some things you can do to work around it. But for right now, we're not worrying about it. It's a class project. I'm going to happily use it. Or we could say our target audience is smartphones, and they pretty much all do it. So anyway, whatever that means. Okay, so what's this? What's this greater than sign all about? We're targeting the div. The last thing to appear is the thing that we're actually targeting. So what's the relationship between main and div here? Yeah, John, you were starting to say. It's a child. So the difference between that and this could have another element in between. Because this is just saying a descendant, not necessarily a direct and immediate child. This is saying the div must be a direct child of main. Why did I bother? So here's a div that's a direct child. Here's a div that's a direct child. But I happen to know that when stats gets built out, there are going to be all these color divs in there. And I don't want this rule to apply to those. I don't want it to apply to deeply nested divs, just divs that are immediately inside main. Then I do some other fun stuff. Ooh, plus. What the heck does that mean? What is this saying? Anybody ever seen that selector before? So plus means adjacent sibling. In other words, an LI that immediately follows another LI. So for example, this paragraph here, if I had a selector P plus P, that would match this one. It would not match this one because it is not an adjacent sibling to another one. There's not one right before it. So a P that immediately follows another P would be P plus P. So in this case, an LI that immediately follows another LI that is a descendant of a description list. And I set some margin top. So what's the point of that? I want some space between each of these, but I don't want the top one to start way down the page. I don't want a top margin on it. I want a top margin on all the others. So this effectively gets all but the first. Then there's some other stuff we won't talk about. This one's a little interesting. That's a pseudo class. So classes, you remember, are dot. A pseudo class is a colon. And pseudo classes you don't add to the elements. They get added automatically by the browser under certain circumstances. The most common one by far is hover. So you have a link on the page. It does not currently have the pseudo class hover. The second you hover your mouse over it, it has the pseudo class hover. And if you had a style, suddenly that rule applies. Until you move your mouse out, then the pseudo class goes away. You can guess what this means. This means every other one is going to have a background color of white smoke instead of white, which is just slightly off-white. So notice every other one has a slightly different background color. It's all nice and stripy. You dig? And that, friends, is pretty much person stats.